Today, we're talking about MDT quality collaboration. This is, as Olivia said, the first of a series of lunch and learns. We'll talk a little bit more about what those are after we hear from our distinguished guest today. But we're excited to give you an opportunity just to relax, learn a little bit about the Barnahus model, learn a little bit about what it takes to really support kids and families who have been victims of abuse, and to learn some interesting information from a very qualified expert in the field. So I'm happy to turn it over to James Herbert. James, as many of you know, is a research associate professor at the Australian Centre for Child Protection. His work focuses on that intersection between child protection, criminal justice, all of the agencies that come together to really respond to children and families in need. So, James, I will turn it over to you to hear from you about quality collaboration.
Cool. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, very, very conscious that this is absolutely Greg's area too. So very excited about some of the questions that you might have by the end of this. So I will work on sharing my screen.
As James is
So it,
doing that, I'll just invite everybody to feel free to share questions as they have them in the chat, but we will take about 15 minutes towards the end to discuss questions and have some conversation.
yeah. So just checking that you have my screen. Excellent. All right. So extending on last week's presentation about child outcomes. So today we're moving to focus on collaboration quality. So from the children's direct experience of the response of the response to abuse to more of the hidden processes that are hopefully happening in the background that really produce that seamless and consistent response we're wanting to see for all kids going through Barnahus. So we often talk about collaboration in terms of teams. For Barnahus, I think it's often relevant. It's probably relevant to talk about collaboration between systems. So while often there is a core group of professionals that work together all the time that would consider themselves a team, it can differ quite a bit across different Barnahus in terms of who is considered in the scope of that team. So yeah, and that's definitely the case for Australia as well, that there's usually these are kind of collaborative agreements between different agencies. So we would think about them more in terms of systems collaboration, because the professional you're dealing with might change each time in terms of who has responsibility for the case. So yeah, I just thought I'd start off with that point. So I'll start with a bit of a setup on why we undertook this review and how it fits into the overall project. I'll set some grounding on what collaboration means in these types of responses. So what are we expecting to see? I'll talk about the review we've completed and has recently been published in Children and Youth Services Review, and the implications of it for the framework. And just so we end on a positive and hopeful note, I'll quickly cover what the research literature suggests about improving collaboration quality. So I'll aim to talk for about 30 minutes, leave plenty of time for discussion, and if there's anything I breeze past a bit too quickly, please feel free and I can elaborate a little bit further. So I want to highlight that this project is a big team effort across 3 institutions across the world, Australia, Adelaide University, the University of Edinburgh, University of Hildesheim, University of Bedfordshire. There's 4. And yeah, very, very grateful for the goodwill and specialisms across the team, particularly in being able to draw on experts on research with children, which is a really important of the overall piece of the overall work. And particularly for this review, I wanted to highlight Rachel Tyndall, who was a really important part of the coding and working through the studies. And I know she's online, even though it's very late where she is. And I saw you too, Sylvie. You're there. And yeah, so just to position this collaboration quality review within the overall project, we're interested in how we would go about establishing a common baseline of data across different types of Barnahus. We're interested in how do we make these really informed comparisons between different ways of doing Barnahus, different contexts that it's being implemented in? How do we kind of piece together this evidence base for interventions that often look quite different? So we're interested in how do we kind of collect a common baseline of data, but also consider the differences between context and models in developing the evidence base for Barnahus. So within that, we have three streams that are informing how we're thinking about the framework. So last week, Camille and Sylvie talked about the child outcomes element, which is feeding into the what matters to us consultation work. There's also a stream where we're examining the differences and similarities across Barnahus and the contexts that they operate in, which will feed straight into the theory of change element. But today we're focusing on the collaboration review and what we're calling really the engine of the Barnahus response. So each of these streams will inform a theory of change white paper, which will step out the most complete understanding of how Barnahus is expected to improve outcomes, which will in turn form a draft framework. And following much consultation and redevelopment, we will pilot the framework to see whether we've got it right. But moving on to collaboration. So what does it mean to collaborate well in the context of these types of responses? So regardless of whether or not we plan it, the systems and professionals that respond to abuse are interacting with each other. This might be informally or possibly only known from the perspective of the people going through these systems. There's long been a recognition that there are potential systems harm and inefficiency that can come from not properly coordinating these systems. And given who's in the room, I can only imagine the wealth of experiences and examples. But even in these planned systems, children and their families can experience confusion and uncertainty, decisions that don't seem connected, or things that don't happen the way that they're supposed to. The hope of collaborating and planning our responses is that the best use of these different knowledges, expertise, resources, and skills are used to pursue the best possible outcomes. There are, of course, differences in opinions and differences in recommended action, but instead of these playing out through phone tag, individually, people yelling at each other down the phone, or in front of children and families, these are ironed out and resolved, before the case to provide a better experience. And that the principles and expectations we have for these systems are much more visible and accountable. So two important points. While we can plan these responses, it's ultimately individuals that carry them out. So we need to be very attentive to this individual level factor of professionals, as well as, building these wonderful buildings and planning out these great systems for how this is all going to work. And, really, really covered really well last week was that we're often missing a really critical indicator of how things are going, which is children and families' holistic experience of these responses, which, is often something that gets lost in all the KPIs and monitoring. So what makes collaborating in these multi-agency responses hard to do? There's been a long history of research on why working collaboratively is hard, usually focusing on the difference between police and child protection services, but more recent research considering the barriers to working across a much wider range of agencies and disciplines. So firstly, individuals. So some people are just unwilling to see the bigger picture of their work and focus on they want to focus on their individual responsibilities and mandate rather than I guess the bigger picture of what's going on for children and families. This tends to go hand in hand with institutional cultures that are command control oriented, and these can be quite punitive to individuals that deviate from set procedures or institutional views about abuse or how you're supposed to respond to it. So I guess that's to say that collaboration does require quite a high level of psychological safety to practice well. I've done my best to not be too academic-y in this presentation, but I'm really drawn to this conceptualization of the difficulties of collaborative work. So in the context of Barnahus, Johansson talks about the concept of juridification, which is really describing the tendency for legal processes to take priority over all other considerations in multi-agency work. And I guess the phenomena over time that you might start with a really balanced perspective on, here's what our response is here to do. The creeping trend for legal considerations to be prioritized over the needs of children over the lifetime of these models. Consistently in the research, workloads are really highlighted as a key barrier to collaborating effectively, in part reflecting that collaboration by organizations is often seen as an optional extra in the context of this work rather than core to working effectively. I've already talked a bit about the need for structures, by which I mean agreed procedures for working across agencies, whether they be co-located multi-agency teams or more interagency responses that set out procedures for how cases are going to be responded to. In addition to institutional cultures, there's also differences from disciplinary cultures or the backgrounds and training of people working in collaborative responses. So these different backgrounds can sometimes mean that people frame cases in different ways or are really drawn to particular elements of cases. This can be a strength or, in some cases it can create, insurmountable difficulties in different perspectives on cases. One of the things we want multi-agency responses to do is to resolve the complexity of the different mandates of the agencies involved. And of course, countless others. So just the general difficulty of this work and the complex tangle of systems we've inherited to respond to abuse. So how does collaborating well potentially improve things? So in some previous work, we examined the theory of change in the published literature, which just means that what are the assumptions about how doing a multi-agency response how is it supposed to improve things? And this is kind of what we came up with, observed from the literature. So we're interested in creating systems that speed up information exchange so that decisions reflect the most complete understanding of what's happening, ensuring that agencies and disciplines working in a complementary way, but also have the benefit of these different perspectives. As I mentioned, we have a clearer view of the response so that principles like child-friendly practice are adhered to across agencies and that there's shared accountability for this. Previous research also outlined assumptions about efficiency gains reflected in more timely responses and reduced repeated questioning and redundant procedures, but also that teams are able to work around the systems that they're in and employ a bit of creativity and flexibility in working around their constraints. And yeah, most of these have been observed and tested as part of evaluation studies looking at multi-agency responses. Which leads us to the review. So for this review, we were really interested in how to better understand how to define and measure collaboration quality and how it relates to the types of things we put in place when we do multi-agency responses like Barnahus. So the review has two parts. The first involved examining how collaboration quality is defined across studies, including these existing measures. The second involved examining existing measures. So these were typically surveys identified in the search and comparing them against the domains we identified in the first part of the search. So going through, examining how they were developed, their reliability, validity, and ultimately how useful they will be for the Barnahus context. And this will be a good point to acknowledge a key difference between the majority of the literature is drawn from child advocacy centres. And as I said before, they sort of assume a standing team from each of the agencies. So a group of workers that may, interact with each other quite regularly. Barnahus is generally different in that there may be some stable team members, others will change regularly. So that scope of who is part of the team and who is a collaborative partner is a little bit different. I think for most of the Barnahus I visited or learned about, they would have their core team members as, the agency. They're usually from the same agency and work together. And then maybe the police, prosecutors, and child protection workers that are coming through, they would see them as collaborative partners, but not necessarily part of a team. So that's an important consideration given most of the research literature is North American. And ideally, we'd like to identify a measure that would also make sense to use in a non-Barnahus condition. So we're interested in collaboration between systems rather than between teams. So to explore the questions, we completed a rapid search of the research literature, which resulted in the identification of 38 eligible studies. We were interested in studies that asked professionals to define or describe collaboration quality, or studies that involve measuring collaboration quality. And we went back through, looked at the items, looked at the subscales and the types of constructs that they were measuring. And of course, studies had to be in the context of multi-agency responses to abuse. As I mentioned, majority of the research literature we identified was North American. We're looking at kind of a mix of qualitative studies, mixed methods, and surveys. Generally, what we were looking at were general cross-agency interactions, so people being interviewed about, working with a bunch of different agencies rather than a formal response. I think 10 of them involved actual CAC or Barnahus type responses, so that there was a bit of diversity in terms of the types of responses that were captured. So this intimidating looking diagram, but we will zoom into a much more manageable view soon. We have essentially identified 6 themes with each with several sub-themes underneath them. And we've kind of grouped them into preconditions so the first run is preconditions. So these are really the inputs or the things that influence the potential to collaborate well. The second row are mediators or factors that appear to be influenced by whether the Barnahus has been implemented well. And the dynamic mediators, so these are really kind of reflecting actual collaboration happening in action. So we'll be able to get into those. Importantly, I should note that the sub-themes we identified include lots of really established concepts in the psychological literature. So while we've organized them under these kind of themes, many of these are their own kind of body of literature and their own kind of concepts that will need to be measured individually. So for example, looking at this, so it's possible that you respect your colleague and their knowledge and experience, but also feel like they're unreliable and you can't get access to them and talk to them when you need to. So what that means is for measuring things, we will need to say, I guess, measure these as distinct constructs or ideas rather than smushing them all into one measure. So that is a lot of information. So we'll dive into each of these organizing themes, starting with the top. So for each of these, I've stepped out the definition that we developed from the information drawn from the included studies and provided a bit of an illustration of what it might sound like from a worker that is in a response where this part of it is going well. So the first theme was we called systemic enablers. So this is sort of the organizational context. So these are really the top-down inputs that individual teams often can't control, but are really important for success. So things like having adequate resources, so funding, staffing, time, having proper active organizational support from their leadership. So agencies that, are actively involved in the governance and organizing of the Barnahus, and joint training. So a really key intervention across a lot of studies for, I guess, building that shared knowledge and understanding across workers. So not just training people to participate in a multi-agency model, but doing that training together as a cross-disciplinary group, and ideally learning a bit more about each other's roles and potentially even doing a bit of scenario work in terms of how everyone's role is supposed to synthesize together. So my sense of like a person who would say their systemic enablers are working really well is our organization is, so this is what they would be saying. Our organization is proud to work in the Barnahus model. The time to participate in the case review and other meetings is acknowledged in my workload, and new people coming into the model receive a really clear induction and opportunity to learn more about how it works. So that sounds like a person that's pretty happy with their systemic enablers. The next theme we called structural frameworks. So again, this is another precondition or sort of background to collaboration quality. So these are the sort of tangible agreed upon rules and physical setups that facilitate working across agencies. So these are things like the existence and utility of written protocols and agreements, how workable they are. Clear governance structures that are active and accessible with all partners represented, and infrastructure that supports collaborative work. So things like just having shared facilities that facilitate that sort of work, uh, be it co-located or sort of visiting. And even things like designated coordinators that sort of manage the load of doing that collaborative work. So someone where that is going quite well for might say something like, the 5 agencies involved in our Barnahus spent a lot of time thinking about how it would work. They've planned it out really well and have stayed really engaged in reviewing and updating procedures. We have excellent facilities that make it easy to work together while allowing space for individual agency business. So again, that sounds pretty good. So that's structural frameworks. So cognitive foundations. So this we described as kind of the shared mental model. So this is kind of the connection of, I guess, of the sort of underlying idea about how it's going to work. This is how individuals actually put that into practice. So this is, I guess, how models have been internalized and implemented by those people that actually work in the model. This is where implementation meets organizational culture and the degree to which the pressures people are under permit them to take a more holistic view of their work. So the sub-themes include things like shared goals and mission, which is usually alignment to a children first mission, or some other complementary purpose for working in the Barnahus model. Shared knowledge. So, for example, understanding each other's legal constraints, understanding each other's work pressures, workloads, professional mandates, that sort of thing. And role clarity and interdependence. So avoiding gaps and unnecessary overlap, having a clear understanding of how the different parts of everyone's different roles fit together to create a better whole. So someone where this is going quite well would say something like, we are a well-oiled machine at this point. While we each have our own responsibilities, our decision-making is adaptable to the context and the needs of the child. The work has been done to create the model that aligns what we each do, but we're still learning from each other all the time. So the next theme, relational foundation. So this is much more the interpersonal climate. So how people feel about each other. As I said before, this is going to sound a little bit different in Barnahus because we're not talking about a consistent team that's the same people all the time. So some of the things about trust and respect for each other will look a little bit different because it's not the same people every time. So this is the degree to which the model has been internalized and integrated into thinking. It's the degree of trust and respect between workers. So much more in the realm of those interpersonal connections, but recognizing that organizational culture can really affect the view of other professionals. So if you have this negative perception of a particular agency you work with, the person you'd be collaborating with comes in with a bit of a disadvantage. So the sub-themes included mutual trust, so belief in reliability and the honesty of the collaborative partners, professional respect, so whether you value the expertise and knowledge of that particular person. And the next theme was psychological safety, so the ability to take interpersonal risks or admit errors without fear of blame. So again, this is where a lot of the individual factors sit. Acknowledging that it can sometimes just take one difficult person to undermine the capacity of collaborative work. So someone where this is going quite well would say something like, across the people I work with, we respectfully disagree with each other. This is a good thing. We all have different knowledge and experience that adds value to the way we respond to the case. The police I work with are very reliable, and I hope they feel the same about me. So getting into, I guess, what we would call collaboration in action, the actual doing of collaboration, we described this theme as active processes. So the actual translation from the foundations into tangible activities. So clearly the actual activities are going to differ between different types of responses, but are generally built around doing the same types of things, which is coordination and joint planning. So ensuring that there's a cohesive plan across agencies that is consistent in the work. Shared decision making, so building consensus between different collaborative partners. Conflict resolution, so being able to respectfully and directly manage disagreements between collaborators, and having a process for bringing conflicts to leaders at a cross-organizational level if needed, and monitoring feedback and accountability. So just being able to practice in a way where it's observable to other disciplinary groups, and there's a higher level of accountability across groups, because it's not just your sort of in-group. So what that would look like, might sound like, is we have meetings with our colleagues across agencies for each case, and these are really useful in planning out what we are all going to do and what might happen as a result. It's a lot better than trying to get people on the phone who don't work nights. I think that's a pretty common experience across multi-agency teams, across different discipline groups that, don't work the same hours. And finally, communication. So this is another collaboration in action. So this is the other piece of the work of actually doing collaboration. So the quality, timeliness, accuracy, and openness of communication, the frequency of communication, the channels, having different ways of communicating with each other, having a problem-solving focus rather than a blame focus, and the use of information sharing systems. So even if something as simple as specific rules around information sharing due to legislation, or technological solutions to help stay updated about the case. So this person might say something like, while our initial meetings are really important, it's the follow-up that matters most. If someone sees something in a home visit that's really concerning or changes the plan of what we're all doing, that's communicated right away, and we work to solve the problem. So those were our 6 themes. So the second part of the review was really aimed at examining existing measures and their suitability for measuring collaboration quality in the Barnahus context. So we mapped 13 of these measures and completed a review of how they were developed, how they're used, and whether they've been tested and standardized and validated. So the conclusion of this was that no single measure sort of worked for this purpose, but the best approach would be to compile a series of measures from across these existing measures to address each of the concepts that we're interested in. So while we did attempt to do this in the report, there's a bit more work to do in adapting these items and scales for the Barnahus context. So the next stage for this collaboration quality stream will be to redevelop and test a compiled measure of collaboration quality to include in the framework. So ultimately, the aim of having this measure would be to measure the effect of implementing a Barnahus or different, policy changes or elements of a Barnahus, so that we can see the connection between, implementing something different and the collaboration quality. So, that sort of connection between doing things in a more joint structure, so formalizing, collaborative work, and the actual performance of collaboration. I think that would be something really useful to see. The next step of that is to examine the relationship between collaboration quality and the types of outcomes we'd be expecting to see from Barnahus. So does having different elements of collaboration quality in place translate to outcomes? And that's something that's been done in the US that we'd be really keen to do at a different scale in Barnahus in Europe. Now, conscious that lots of people here are in Barnahus and would be well aware of the things going well and the things not going well in your collaborations, I wanted to focus on possible approaches to improving collaboration quality. The framework, I think, lays out our understanding of how these different sets of themes connect to each other. But I wanted to close by pointing to including a few points to think about. Really obvious one, anything you can do to make it more pleasant for collaborating partners to come to the Barnahus, usually food, but anything that helps build positive rapport between workers and create the best opportunity for people to connect with each other and have a positive experience. So yeah, maybe see what your collaborative partners need when they visit. Uh, Particularly, visiting groups will have experiences with lots of different professionals from other disciplines, and it's pretty natural that we get stuck with times where we've had a negative interaction with, say, police or child protection authorities. So anything you can do to encourage letting go of those negative assumptions and being ready to work with whoever walks in the door, I think is going to be really beneficial. Uh, and look, most of you will already have guidelines or protocols in place, but in considering how to improve these, I think the key points that come up are really around confidentiality and information exchange and about conflicting mandates. So yeah, I guess existing research really highlights just how important a good protocol or collaboration agreement is. So number one, it would be continuing to review, discuss, and negotiate clear procedures for how Barnahus is supposed to work, and particularly documenting how the response differs for different types of cases. Um, Potentially explore having a coordinator. I know more positions is a very tough sell, but potentially anything that reduces the individual workload associated with collaborating with other agencies for those key workers will potentially reduce time and role pressures and make collaborating a more pleasant experience for everyone. And while most responses have training on the response or even some level of learning about other agencies' roles, training that engages workers with goal-oriented learning can be much more engaging. So think about things like scenario-based learning and reflection that charges groups with developing interagency policy or developing proposals to put to the governance groups of Barnahus. So getting towards summing up, I covered a bit about what I think we're looking for when we talk about collaboration quality. I outlined our current project and how we're aiming to build the measurement of collaboration quality into some of the measures we recommend, and the findings of our review into collaboration quality and what I think we'll need to measure as part of this approach. So I wanted to make sure there's lots of time left for discussion, which I think I have done. So hopefully I've worked through that and I will check the questions.